Jonny Miller, welcome.
Great to be here.
So I have a burning question that I would love to just ask you directly. Normally I take a reader question for you all, but I just have one that I wanted to ask straightforwardly, which is, what are kind of three of your favorite somatic approaches to chronic anxiety?
Yeah, great. So thank you, Nick. I think one of my favorite phrases, I'll start with this idea of state over story. And what this basically means for me is when we experience anxiety or chronic anxiety, there's often a way in which we get caught in these kind of thought loops of like, oh, this thing happened, and then it just kind of exacerbates. And it's actually much more effective to kind of intervene in a like body-based approach versus trying to kind of jump in on the level of like thought and reason. Like so many people will kind of like have these like shouting matches in their heads, or they'll be like a kind of oppressive inner critic, and they'll be like, no, I'm not this bad person, or whatever it is. And
fight back. Most
people can probably relate to this. There's this back and forth, and it doesn't actually help. If anything, it kind of makes it worse. Versus what you can do is if you intervene at the level of your body, at the level of somatics, typically using the breath, which is like the easiest lever, you can kind of like cut the negative vicious spiral short. And you can activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which creates this sense of calm and ease. And from that place, the thoughts and the stories that you have tend to be much more relaxed. And the kind of activated parts of you get just kind of relieved. And so if the goal is to kind of downshift, let's say, before giving an important presentation or before having a difficult conversation, I find changing, like deliberately shifting your state and making that the emphasis before going into story or strategy. Like, yeah, definitely that's important, but do it from a place where you're grounded and present in your body.
I like this so much because I heard you talk about this initially, and I was like, oh, that's an interesting idea. Like, I could see how that could be kind of helpful. But then I started playing around with it with my clients, and I found it to be really helpful because in the kind of therapy world, there was this, like, the initial kind of cognitive revolution in therapy was all about like, thoughts generate emotions. So like analyze your thoughts, find all the errors and distortions, and like counteract them with more realistic ways of thinking. And, there's something to that, but it's got a lot of shortcomings. And there's this third wave approach, which says, no. Like, instead of getting into it with your thoughts, like, you could just let them be and refocus your attention somewhere else. Like, you don't have to do anything about the thought. You don't have to get into a conversation with it. And I think that makes a lot of sense, and it has been really powerful. But certain people, understandably, have a hard time with this idea of, it's kind of a negative exhortation to just like, well, don't get in a conversation with your thoughts. That's the thing, is like, don't do X. And because there's nothing positive of like what to do, it's hard, it's challenging.
Totally.
So part of how I've found what you're suggesting, this like state over story thing, is like, you can acknowledge the thoughts, but then you can go into your body as a way of achieving the same thing of disengaging from the story and from the thoughts.
Yeah.
And then, so many positive effects come from that. But I found it to be a really nice on-ramp to this idea of, I can just let my thoughts be there. I don't have to engage with them. But it gives people some structure to be able to do that thing that's kind of abstract. Sorry, that's a lot, but I have found it super helpful.
It's great. There's so much there. And I think, the thing for me is it's just so effective. You can do some of these practices, and within less than a couple of minutes, really, you're already much less activated, and it's much easier to engage from that place once you've found that kind of place of grounding. There's kind of really interesting science around this as well, in that we have 4 times as many afferent neurons going from like the body to the brain as from the brain to the body. So in terms of dictating our state, using the levers of the body, again, typically breath, but could also be like long stretching, things like that. Even using the eyes and the visual field, it's like a much stronger lever for helping us feel better, which is essentially, I think, what a lot of people are kind of looking to do with this work. Is like, how do I just feel better? How do I feel like myself again? So I'm not like hijacked by whatever's going on.
Yeah. Even just something as simple as like, how do you feel in your body? Like, how does literally just like, how does your body feel? Like, label it. Like, my shoulders are kind of tense, or I've got kind of like knots in my tummy, or what. Like, it's kind of amazing how something as simple as that can be profoundly powerful. So anyway, I love that one. All right. So that's a great first kind of start, is this mantra of like state over story. So where does it go from there? Like is there a second one that sort of follows from that?
Yeah, so the second one is, this is probably the more controversial one, and I'm curious to dig into this with you, but it's this idea of welcome everything. And typically when people talk about anxiety, I mean, even you and I, sometimes we put out videos, it's like conquer anxiety, like defeat your anxiety, tackle your anxiety. And it's this sense of like we're waging war against our anxiety. And so the complete opposite of that is this idea of like actually welcoming our anxiety, to kind of view anxiety as a part of ourselves that is looking to keep us safe. And maybe the strategy is terrible. And I actually thought of, we have a golden retriever at home, and she was barking so loudly at like someone outside and basically like trying to keep us safe last night. And the strategy wasn't great, but she like, it was coming from a good place, right? She was trying to like protect her owners. So instead of like shouting at her and like, you know, getting really annoyed, we just like gave her a treat and kind of like redirected the attention to bring it back inside. And I think it's very similar with like the parts of ourselves that are these, in internal family systems kind of speak, there are these protector parts, and some of the protectors use anxiety as a way to keep us safe from whether feeling certain emotions or having certain experiences. And so instead of like, the actual kind of tactic here is, instead of when you notice the activation or the anxiety kind of allowing that fear to turn into like a kind of negative spiral, what if you just kind of get curious, and B, kind of like actively welcome, or like, I sometimes think about like giving it a hug, or saying the phrase to myself, like come here, my friend, just, or like, thank you. And as soon as I do that, I notice that the anxiety has like, it has kind of it lives in my body somewhere. And, you know, a lot of people will say, oh, it's in my throat, or it's in my chest, or it's in my gut.
Sure.
If you almost say those words, something like thank you, or like welcome it, whilst also kind of breathing into or feeling into that place, it will just kind of relax and be like, oh, like it's okay. Like I'm good. I'm not being bad in some way. And again, like that can sometimes just like completely nip it in the bud, or it can also sometimes be a signpost to, you know, something deeper that then gets to be felt through, worked through, and integrated eventually.
Gotcha. Yeah, I love these ideas of, well, yeah, welcome everything, but more specifically, get curious and actively welcome. And I think, so if I'm hearing you correctly, I think it is that it is what this literally looks like is maybe asking, if you're going to get curious, like, oh, like, what are you trying to help me with here? Like, I wonder what this part of my brain or my body is trying to help me with, right? Or like, would that be an example of the curious one?
Yeah, totally. And I think there's a good maybe analogy here to, like, if you imagine you have some like a bunch of kids, a lot of the kind of traditional...
I have a bunch of kids.
A bunch of kids, great.
It's not too hard to imagine.
So a lot of people, like, they might use the mindfulness and they might like be aware of it. But like, if you imagine like there's some like scared, frustrated kids in the room, if you're just like aware of them, that's so different from like giving them a big hug, or like being like, how are you doing? Like, what's up for you? It's such a contrast in terms of like felt sense. And I think so many people are just like, they're like aware of the angry kids, but they don't actually engage with a sense of like loving awareness or curiosity.
That's why, like, I get kind of emotional just thinking about that, Jonny, because like, I imagine myself, like, how many times are my kids like aware of me, and they're aware that I'm aware of them, but they're not feeling connected. Like, really, you know, it's that old thing of like, you know, your parents love you, but how often do they tell you, kind of thing. Like, there's a really big difference between those two. Yeah. And then, like, as much as I think that's so powerful with my kids, like, what about with myself? How often am I just like, yeah, I know you're there, self, and there's like different parts of me and blah, 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 all the IFS. But like, how often am I actively taking the time to like thank parts of myself for trying to keep me safe, or expressing gratitude to myself, or being genuinely curious and kind of like listening maybe to what my parts of myself are trying to tell me? Like, I'm just talking through what you've explained much more articulately, but like, it's kind of powerful when you really think about it. Yeah, so I think it's wildly profound. Totally.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that like, I know this myself, and it's still like, even this morning, I was like kind of talking to a part of myself before a workshop and just like giving some reassurance. And it's such a beautiful perspective, because it also completely reframes it again, like moving away from that battle and that sense of like I'm fighting a part of myself, and you're feeling like you're constantly at war with yourself, to how can I just learn to like eventually welcome all of the parts of myself that have been in some way like rejected or disowned or told they were bad, maybe by a teacher at school or whatever it was. And often the inner critics are like the internalized voice of a critical parent or the internalized voice of a shitty teacher. And so we're really just like consoling that younger part of ourselves in these moments.
You know, I love this idea of welcoming, because it reminds me of, I had a mentor really early on in my kind of graduate training when I first got interested in psychology. And I remember him telling me one time, just offhandedly in a conversation, he was like, the answer to every type of anxiety is willingness. He said, willingness is like the magic word. The answer to all anxiety is willingness.
Yeah.
And I remember being like, oh yeah, whatever, like fortune cookie, that sounds nice. But my entire career as a psychologist, especially working with people with anxiety, is coming to realize how true that one statement is. Like that literally is my, like, I have been growing into that statement, and getting less worse at being a therapist and coach as I get more, as I really come to understand what that really means and how powerful that is. I love it. It totally echoes what you're saying with welcome.
I love that as well. And you know what, like through some of my the hardest times in my life, the phrase like, I am willing, has got me through it. Like it's like, I am willing to embrace this anxiety, or to feel the fear beneath it, or to feel the, like whatever's there. It really is this just like, I'm willing to like lean into this.
I love it. All right. You want to take us home? Third and final suggestion?
Yeah, number 3. So this is super practical. And people are probably going to listen to this and be like what? Like, that's ridiculous. But the practice itself is, in the literature, it's known as the single breath hum. But it is essentially humming. And the two mechanisms at play here, one of them is the hum itself creates vibrations in the sinus cavity and releases nitric oxide, which is a vasodilator, which promotes that relaxation response. So that's one of the mechanisms.
Can I pause you here in between mechanisms? Like, are you? We're just literally talking about
I'll demonstrate in a.
Okay, you're going to do it. All right, good.
Yeah.
I want to make sure it's not a metaphor for anything. We're literally humming. Okay,
literally humming. Why is it?
Sorry, I interrupted the.
It's great.
Overview.
So
keep going.
So that's the first mechanism. The second mechanism is if you hum all the way to the end of your exhale, then the extended exhale also has a parasympathetic effect.
Oh, so like till you're out of breath, basically.
Not until you're like, you have like air, like mild air hunger, I would say. Like not like gasping, but just like kind of the end of a natural breath. And you can, if you want to look especially weird, I've sometimes done this on trains or public places, you can amplify the vibration effect by basically like raise your hands to your head. You put your thumbs kind of in your ears, these two fingers over your eyes, and this ring finger on the bridge of your nose. So you're not like pressing, but you're just like lightly touching parts of your face. So let's do it together. Do 2 rounds.
Let's do it.
You full inhale through the nose, closing the mouth, and then hum all the way to the end of exhale. So.
All right.
One more. And then lowering down your hands. And how do you feel any different? How did that feel?
I'm getting some weird cognitive dissonance, which is the story, talking about state over story. The story is like, well, this is weird. Like I can only imagine what we look like on camera. And the contrast with like immediately feeling this kind of like lack of like release of tension, maybe is the word I'm struggling for.
Exactly.
Crazy, like that contrast.
Yeah.
But I definitely feel it just after humming.
And you can totally do it without the hands over the face thing. That just kind of increases the effect.
Sure.
And I think, I feel like it's literally impossible to have a panic attack while you're humming. Like there's a way in which it just discharges tension from your body as you're doing it. And you can do this, like sometimes I'll do it while I'm making lunch, like after a busy work morning, or like, you can literally do it anywhere. Do it with your kids. and it's super accessible, super fun, and surprisingly effective.
Okay, I'm going to put a disclaimer on this as a kind of like cognitive behavioral psychologist, and I want to see if you agree with this or not. I am always very careful of, like, part of my job as a coach with anxiety specifically is I'm always looking for what are called safety behaviors, which are any kind of behavior, mental or physical, where the goal is to avoid anxiety or to get rid of anxiety.
Yes.
And all sorts of things can be safety behaviors. It can be like repeating a positive mantra to yourself, or doing a mindfulness practice or a deep breathing exercise or whatever. So like anything can be a means of avoidance. 100%. But when you do that, when you're running away from, to your second point about welcoming, not avoiding, you're teaching your brain that the anxiety is bad, which tends to only make it worse long term. So when I hear about a new like technique or practice or exercise around anxiety, I'm always thinking of like, this seems awesome. And I worry that people would use it as an avoidance. Like, oh my God, I'm so anxious. I can't be this anxious. Like, quick, do my humming exercise to not feel anxious anymore. So how do you, when you're working with clients or students, like, how do you address that dilemma?
Yeah, so I actually, wonderful timing. I did a workshop specifically on anxiety this morning, and one of our students from two or 3 years ago, her name's Tessa. She did one of the early cohorts of Nervous System Mastery, the program that I ran, and she said that for her, initially learning the kind of down regulation somatic breathing practices, specifically humming, I think was the main one she used. It gave her a sense of agency, and she stopped fearing the activation response in her system because she knew that she could hum or do a breathwork practice and come back down. And then once that fear of an activation state was kind of lessened and almost gone, she was then able to have the capacity to do some of the more challenging kind of like inner work of welcoming, embracing, and exploring what was underneath. And so like that's really how I think about it. For someone who's experiencing panic attacks or who's, really in chronic anxiety, the first step is really to just increase safety and to increase their capacity so that they're not kind of constantly going outside of their window of tolerance. And then from that place of, a little bit more grounded safety, that's when you can really begin to welcome, explore, get curious, all the things that we just talked about. So I do kind of see it as somewhat sequential. And they can all, this can also be done in the space of 5 minutes. Like you could hum for, let's say, 90 seconds, and then you're like, oh, like I feel like I'm more in my body, I'm less disassociated, I can actually feel the sensations that the anxiety is connected to. Like now I'm going to explore and like see what's here.
I wonder too if there's like, how do you think about the preventative intervention versus like fixing it? Like I'm going into a situation tomorrow that I know is going to be really stressful. So today I'm going to try and do a lot of, I'm going to try and do a lot of work in various ways to get myself into a good place so that I'm not as high strung going into this difficult situation versus the like, oh my God, I'm anxious. What do I do? So I assume this could be used kind of for both. But how do you think about that?
100% can be used for both. So there's maybe two things here to mention. One is that also the more kind of like awareness of your body or somatic awareness you have, you can begin to notice the like 2 out of 10 anxiety when it's like a little tingly on your chest rather than wait for like the 8 or 9 out of 10. Yeah. And it's so much easier to come back to the 2 out of 10, like before you've like gone over the cliff and you're like spiraling down. Because then, it still works then, but it just takes a lot longer to kind of come back. And then
I think that's such an underrated point, by the way, that like building like that spidey sense for things are exactly. And I think part of it is that like, we don't want to acknowledge it. We want to believe that it'll just like go away and it won't turn into a thing. So we kind of, part of it is like the body, like becoming more sensitive. But I do think part of it is like a psychological thing. Like you have to be willing to welcome the 2 out of 10 so that you can make it easier on yourself to come down from it instead of like being in denial until it's a 10 out of 10.
Totally. And sometimes it requires like taking a little bit of spaciousness or course correcting, maybe taking 5 minutes out of your day to like work with it, as opposed to, like you say, like ignoring it, powering through, and then waiting for something more intense. And, sometimes it takes 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 a few times in a row for someone to realize I could have like saved myself a lot of suffering here. And then the second thing I wanted to mention just briefly is I think there's also like, I think of anxiety as like a 2 by 2. And on one axis is activation energy. And on the other axis is like tension constriction. And I think sometimes we can just be like, like very overstimulated. I mean, I think of times when I've like pounded a double espresso and then gone out on my motorbike. And then by like, you know, before midday, I'm like absolutely fried and I'm like shaking and buzzing. And that's purely a function of overstimulation. Or when I came out of silent meditation retreat and I hadn't had any stimulation for 10 days and I went into a supermarket, I was just like, I was like overwhelmed. I freaked out and I had to like go home and into a dark room. So I think there are also times when we're just too overstimulated, and kind of changing our environment or managing our stimuli input is actually a factor as well. And so knowing when it's just a function of your environment and when it's a function of, oh, there's actually an emotion here to be explored, I think that's also part of the kind of like the nuance and the skill in this exploration.
I think that's so important. You know, like a lot of it is in your head or your body, but a lot of it's out there too. You know, like, and it's important to acknowledge that and remind ourselves of that.
Totally. And there's very valid reasons to be, you know, like afraid or freaked out or, you know, scared of stuff. Like
Walmart's a scary place, especially after a silent meditation retreat.
Exactly.
Jonny, these have been awesome. Where can people go to learn more about you and all the work you're doing?
Yeah, totally. So the best place is my website, which is nsmastery.com. It stands for Nervous System Mastery. And on there, there's a self-assessment link. There's a free email course. There's podcast links. There's a whole bunch of resources, and there's also a cohort that we're doing in March, depending on when this gets released. So that's the best place.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Jonny.
Thank you.